From the middle of the 16th century onwards, Bengal saw the establishment of numerous European settlements on its territory, starting with the Portuguese, who were in the Bay of Bengal by the 1520s and began constructing churches in testimony to their presence. By the 17th century, the production of silk had caught the attention of other European traders. The French had a trading post in Chandranagar, while just down the river, the Dutch had a sizable factory from where goods could be shipped to the Asian headquarters in Batavia in modern-day Indonesia. Its remains still stand today and mark the beginnings of a European imprint on the region's architectural landscape. The 18th century saw not only English trade overtake that of the French and the Dutch, but increasingly Bengal's wealth was seen not in its productive capacities, but in the taxation of its largely agrarian population. With the Battle of Plassey on the 23rd of June, 1757, the political ascendancy of the British in Bengal gained momentum, and they now turned their eyes to the collection of its land revenue. While their base in Calcutta had, until then, been confined to Fort William, by the turn of the 19th century, stately buildings and imposing churches had mushroomed across the city. Even today, Calcutta still retains many of these structures, which the British designed in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, such as the Writers' Building with its signature red brick facade, and the Victoria Memorial, which, although completed only in 1921, is a direct offspring of this grandiose architectural vision of the previous century. These buildings made the city resemble a provincial English town such as Bristol or Manchester. Calcutta had become the training ground for a new architectural experiment. In order to rule over such a large population and vast territory, the permanent settlement of 1793 came into effect, by which a new class of Indian landlords appointed by the British would collect state taxes, keeping a portion for themselves in exchange for their service. They were called zamindars, and throughout the 19th century, as they gained in wealth, they sought to portray their favored status by emulating both the lifestyle and aesthetics of their colonial masters. At the National Museum in Dhaka, a range of residential furniture, including massive tables and beds, built at the behest of the region's landed elite in the 19th century, highlight both the European influences and the larger-than-life designs that informed its imagination.
By the end of the 18th century, the British government in Bengal settled the land revenue on a permanent basis with the zamindars. In 1793, the permanent settlement came into effect, which means that the landholders would have to pay a fixed amount to the British government, and this will be permanently settled. But the land revenue in excess collected by these local zamindars will be appropriated by the zamindars. And as time went on, with the pressure of population, with new agriculture coming up, and the area of agriculture expanding within the zamindari, the land revenue increased. The Britishers couldn't get a share of it because it was permanently settled. And the excess gave a surplus to these zamindars. So this elite class were rich by the mid-19th century. And they could show off their wealth as well as their power and proximity to the rulers through these architectural media. The Rajbaris, the palaces they created in the deltaic land, spotted all around, are actually the showpieces of their strength, of their social, economic, and political prominence in the society. And it is this Jamindar class who were in taste, character, and behavior were more European than the Europeans, only they were Indian in blood and color.
From the 1850s onwards, under the patronage of its landed gentry, Bengal witnessed the mushrooming of zamindari palaces as sites of architectural experiments. There is an obvious incorporation of European elements, including sculptures, arches, friezes, grand stairs and front entrances with huge windows on the facades. But while these palaces may seem to be purely transplants from Europe straight into the landscape of rural Bengal, they are in fact products of a new architectural vocabulary based on the encounter of European architecture with local settings that rely on the use of traditional motifs.
You have a multi-storied, huge mansion type of building with several rooms. What you would have locally, I think from what we can judge from the remains of Mughal architecture, are a complex of smaller constructions. So that itself is a new concept of having one huge, large building. These palaces were really public expressions of the power that they were asserting, and the styles also that they were British. The neoclassical styles came with them, and you see the pediments, then the windows which were shutters, glass panes on the windows, sometimes the Venetian blinds. These are all things that came with the British. We know in their personal lives that they tried very much to be with the British. And I think the best examples that we have are from the Tagore family, who have left, the records that we have of that particular family far exceeds anything else. And in their lifestyles, especially the men, the women were more, I think, traditional. But the men, in their personal lives, they emulated the British. When they went to England, Rabindranath's father spent a long time in England, and his habits, the lifestyles that they had were very, very European.
A good example comes from the homes of the family of the Bengali poet Rabindranath Tagore, whose members were not only well-versed in European culture, but were simultaneously representatives of local authority and traditions. This is seen in the very construction of their houses, which rely on the concept of the outer house that displays European items, habits, and aesthetics, while also retaining an inner house which remained the setting for domestic rituals and traditions. This affinity to tradition was spatially expressed, with the family temples often located in close proximity to the Europeanized mansions. Sometimes the two blended together, such as in the palatial home of Rani Bhabani in Attor, whose family temple included both Corinthian columns as well as seated Hindu figures.
Their social position is best reflected in the architecture, because it's a very powerful architecture itself is one of the most powerful visual expressions that you can get. So and the zamindars as a class were created by the British, and they were always very faithful to the British. They were loyal subjects, and they even went into partnership with the British.
One of the more enigmatic aspects to this architectural encounter is to be found in Panam, near Sonargaon, the old capital of medieval Bengal. Here, in between two canals, lies a street with luxurious townhouses on both sides. Built by Hindu jute merchants in the early decades of the 19th century, possibly in imitation of the zamindari palaces, these houses use both decorative and structural elements adopted from European architecture. We find the facades of these houses, with arcades, front pieces, and even iron balustrades, to be imitations of European styles of the period, and highly unusual for an urban Indian setting where homes were turned to the patio rather than the street. Often, the European elements also worked their way inside these houses, many of which use capitals on the pillars, colored glass, in-relief work with coats of arms or crowns, and even inlay work with the Virgin Mary. However, this remained a hybrid style, for the overall layout was an Indian one, with a sheltered inner courtyard for domestic activities, as well as a prayer room. The backyard of the houses led to the canals, which not only served the security and sanitation needs of the residents, but where idols were also immersed during the festivals, and where leisure boating also took place.
These houses represented the class who were aspiring to be prominent in the society, but they were not as prominent as the jamindars, but they had the wealth. So Panam houses represent that class of people, a new class of merchants with wealth showing off in their architecture. And they were copying or emulating the jamindar houses or the houses of the English they saw in Calcutta, and they were having these houses in the fashion of a local architecture with compound courtyards in the middle, rooms all around, but having a large palatial sitting room with a lot of European decorations inside. So it is again a hybrid architecture with European influence as well as the local mindset behind it.
This hybrid style of architecture also influenced the highest stratum of Bengal's aristocracy. The imposing Ehsan Manzil, the former home of the Nawabs of Dhaka and located in the center of the old city, was built between 1859 and 1872. This two-storied palace was established on a raised platform of 1 meter and boasts spacious verandas that rest on semicircular arches, an open stairway making for a dramatic entrance, and that led to the banks of the river, as well as an exquisite dome. Another palace in this style, which rests with the government of Bangladesh, is the Digha Patia Rajpari in Nator. The edifice, as well as its landscaped lawns, represent a meeting between tradition and modernity, but through multiple interpretations of the various parties involved, such as the artisans, of whom little is known, the elites, whose tastes were influenced by the British, and of the individual owner, who may have sought to impose his personal views and practical needs on the final design. Architecture thus becomes an interpretation of an encounter. Ironically, even as the wealthy and aspiring classes of Bengal had begun imitating English architectural styles, British architecture in the region was turning to local building traditions for inspiration. In the port city of Chittagong, which lies in the eastern part of Bangladesh, the old courtroom highlights what many architects believe to be the unequivocal introduction of indigenous elements in public colonial architecture. We thus find curved arches and domes to be an increasingly prominent feature of public buildings. A few miles away is a railway headquarters that also reproduces these characteristic features of long verandas and arches. This development is not an accident. These buildings represented new centers of administrative authority associated with the formation of new local elites. To them, the buildings offered a proximity to European power, but one still rooted in local geography and social context.
After 1857, when we went directly under the British Crown, became a colony that was ruled by Queen Victoria, there were no pretensions anymore. And the British, I think, they looked on themselves as the inheritors of the Mughal tradition. So they incorporated a lot of Mughal features into their buildings. And what is, I think in Bangladesh, you will find Curzon Hall, which looks very much like, if you see side by side with a picture of Fatehpur Sikri, and you see the Ibadat Khana, it's very much of the, the design of the facade, of the front, is very much stylistically related to that. So after officially they became rulers, they incorporated many more of the Mughal or Indian style that was then fashionable, because they looked upon themselves as the inheritors of the Mughal tradition. And it's reflected in painting as it is in architecture.
By the turn of the 20th century, the Curzon Hall in Dhaka, built in 1904, had come to unabashedly represent this new spirit. By blending Mughal arches and domes into its facade, there seemed little doubt here of the British claim to inherit the Mughal imperial legacy. The encounter had now come full circle, and South Asian motifs and patterns would henceforth inform future British architectural projects throughout the subcontinent.